from the Heart.
Hello and welcome back to Horror from the Heart. I'm Josh and welcome to episode 2. So, did my little intro in the first one, told you about where I was coming from as far as like what got me into horror and things like that. And one of the first things I wanted to talk about was about horror in the movies. Now, it's interesting the way horror in movies has gone. It has a big influence on a lot of the movies that we have nowadays, regardless of whatever movie it is that we have. Pretty much almost every single thing out there other than like romantic movies has some kind of horror element to it. And a lot of the horror elements have actually been kind of idolized and stuff like that too. Which to me, I find kind of interesting. Because, you go back to how it was and everything like that with how movies were for the horror genre and stuff like that, and you had the other types of movies that were out there, and you didn't really have that horror influence the way you do nowadays. I mean, zombies are a commonplace type of thing. Weird psycho type of people are a commonplace type of thing, even in, kids' movies nowadays, whereas, like, we wouldn't show stuff like that to kids way back in the day. Now, as far as, like, horror movies themselves, though, I mean, there's, like, a variety of different types of genres, inner genres of horror that are out there. So you have like your sci-fi horror movies, creature features, which are just like the monsters and things like that. You have your psychological thrillers. You have, like your slasher flicks and things like that. It's taken itself and it has split itself up into so many different genres. And I don't think there's really any other genre out there that has been able to do that the way horror has. Sci-fi is a close one when it comes to that kind of stuff, but not the way horror has. Now, one of the things about it is just because of how it's changed. That's one of the reasons why it has split up the way it has. You go back to the way things were, like way back in the day. Look at something like Phantom of the Opera, the original Phantom of the Opera. Like something like that. It was dark, it was mysterious, and it invoked just this kind of like shock and awe, and that was what made it a horror movie. It wasn't grotesque, wasn't overly violent or anything like that. It was just the shock and awe of it that made it into a really good horror movie. And a lot of the horror movies back in the day weren't about grotesque and making you feel like super scared. They put you at the edge of your seat, but it was more about the shock and how things were than it was about actually scaring the crap out of you. And as it progressed and you get into the later ones into like the 50s and stuff like that, that's when it gets more into the idea of like, let's try to scare people with, it came from outer space or The Blob. The Blob was one of those ones where it's like, you watch it now, it's fun, it's campy, but back in the day, it was freaky. And it was just the shock of how this thing was just coming together and wanting to basically eat everything. But it scared the crap out of people, whereas like a lot of us watch the older ones, and it's more of a hysterical little treat than it is anything. But it's because of the way we've progressed. So it started out with like that, with the black and white movies, and it was over the top acting, like I don't even know if soap operas could compare to how the over-the-top acting was when it came to that kind of stuff. But it was really over-the-top acting. Everything was just so dramatized. And they were neat. They were fun, though. And that was one of the things that really kind of helped to boom that kind of stuff, because people went to those movies in droves. Because, I'm going to go take my girlfriend out to go see this movie, because she'll just hang on to me and it'll be, good fun, And it wasn't something that a lot of people out there went to go do. It was not the way it was where there are a dime a dozen nowadays. But the thing about it is, though, is that it's the way they were at that time. They weren't overly shocking. Like I said, you didn't have grotesque violence all over the place. Granted, there are a few older movies that had some kind of like really kind of shocking moments with some of the gore that they did have, surprisingly. Not a lot of movies actually have that kind of stuff, but there were a few of them out there, and that's more, I'd say, I want to say if it's like more closer to the 60s than it would be anything else. Most of it was like really cheesy props, or it was more imaginative than anything. Like I said in the first episode, it was a cutaway, and your imagination was what filled in the gaps, which made it so terrifying, is because, you know, your imagination is doing that, and you can imagine whatever the hell it is that you wanted to imagine. But it made it interesting nonetheless. But it's also pushed the genre into a lot of different ways. So then you get up into the 70s, and it gets a little bit more gruesome when it comes to things. And we get into the late 70s, and that's when you get like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and you get into The Town That Dreaded Sundown, you know, and the violence is actually starting to ramp up, because it's not your typical everyday type of movie that it was way back in the day. You know, and on top of that, you know, it wasn't just creature features, because a lot of the movies from way back in the day were more creature features than they were anything. Even with Dracula, you know, Dracula would technically be kind of like a creature feature, because he's human or humanoid, but he is really a creature. But you get into, you know, later into the 70s and stuff like that, and it gets more grotesque. And you have, like, even the Hammer films. The Hammer films got a lot more grotesque with stuff like that. Probably one of the most grotesque movies way back in the day would have been the Night of the Living Dead, which I think everybody should at least see that one if you're into horror. If you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth the watch, because, I mean, for one, it gives the birth of what we call modern day zombies. And, you know, yeah, they've progressed and everything like that, but it's definitely a lot different compared to how it was. But then we get in from that, and we go into the 80s and the way the 80s were. And to me, 80s were probably the prime area for horror movies. And the whole reason for that is because a lot of them were either just downright scary as all hell, or they were very thought-provoking. And that's when we started to split up into more genres, where it was like the sci-fi genre, the creature features, the slasher flicks, and things like that. You know, Nightmare on Elm Street really picked up during the 80s. The Friday the 13th movies even picked up a lot more in the 80s. But a lot of the effects and the practical effects, the makeup and everything like that, were a lot more advanced than what they were way back in the day, and there was a lot more realism to them. And I think that's kind of what added into the way horror was, because it was more getting away from that whole shocking area and getting more into that actual, or getting away from the fear area, not the shocking area, but getting away from the fear area and getting more into the shocking area, you know, where it was like people blowing up, heads exploding, people getting cut in half, things like that. And it became more of a shock than it was a fear. But there was a lot of movies out there that were, you know, very, very, they would scare the crap out of you, because that's what they did, you know. And I'm pretty sure it was the same thing for back in the 50s and the 60s and things like that, you know. But you look at the way it is now, and you could show somebody a movie from the 80s era, and they would probably still freak out about some of the stuff, or still feel fearful about some of the stuff that happened in those movies, compared to, I'd say, any other time period. And then when we get into the 90s, you know, it gets a little bit more into, they're starting to add the CG, and CG was still, I don't know, like fairly new in a lot of ways. So some of it looked really crappy. Some of them was, you know, it was okay. But that's more when we started to die down a little bit when it came to horror movies. And you didn't see as many out there. There were plenty out there. Don't get me wrong. Plenty of them out there. But it just wasn't as prevalent as it was way back in the 80s. You know, like with the 90s, you had, like, you know, I Know What You Did Last Summer and Scream, and there was a few really, really, really good ones during the 90s. The Faculty, Disturbing Behavior. But again, that's where it ended up going at the 80s, going into the 90s, where it started to split up more and more into different genres. And it really made it more of a diverse genre than, like I said, any other genre that I could think of, because of the fact of that, how it has been. But see, now we're to the modern age, and pretty much almost every single horror movie out there, almost every single movie out there nowadays has some kind of computer graphic thing. And especially when it comes to horror movies, we don't really see a lot of the practical effects that we used to. You can go find indie films that use, a lot of really good practical effects. A lot of them still like to use the practical effects, but you have to really kind of search for some of those because a lot of them just use CG. I mean, hell, even a lot of the indie films out there even use CG because CG has become so modernized and so available to people that they tend to use it. But I think the storytelling of the way things have gone, the way they were compared to now, has kind of degraded in a way. That's my own personal opinion when it comes to that. I'm not saying that there's not a good horror movie out there nowadays that has been made recently, but is definitely not the same as it used to be. And that could be a nostalgia factor for me because, like something like La Llorona didn't scare me. It didn't intrigue me. The Nun didn't intrigue me. Like, she was a freaky character, but the story wasn't all that great. The Annabelle movies, it's like the story wasn't really all that great. And it's not the same. For me, it's one of those ones where if you really want to get a good scare nowadays, you'd have to go more to lesser known, less produced type of films that are out there. Like, look at Hush out there on Netflix. Hush was a good one. The Collector was a good one, but these aren't movies that you'd go out to the movie theater to go see anymore. The big productions just don't make the same kind of quality as they used to. Now they could. Now if you actually got some people who were really into horror and you didn't have studios out there actually messing with everything that were going to be put out there or saying, no, you can't do this or no, you can't do that, or we want it this way, we want the happy ending type of thing, you'd probably get a lot different results and you'd probably actually get some good quality horror movies that are out there. Now, with that though, I'm kind of curious as to what you guys think as far as your favorite horror movie, or if what your favorite genre is even. Are you into the 80s horror movies? Are you into the old school horror movies? Are you into the newer horror movies? Do you think I'm just flat out wrong when I say that? But I'm really kind of curious as to what you guys think. Because, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the episode. If you made it all the way through, thank you for listening. If you're watching this on YouTube, leave a comment down below and leave a like if you did like the video. If you're listening to this on a podcast, then if you can, please leave me a review. Let me know what you think. You can also follow me at HorrorFTH on Twitter. And I'll see you guys in the next episode.